We do need to. Do you have the actual thing on, by the way, so you can check the audio?
Yeah, I can do that.
And just check to see if the audio works. And
By
if
by feedback, I'll mute it when it does.
yeah, it's definitely gonna feedback.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it'll feedback.
It's live. Do you hear anything? Testing,
Not,
testing. All right, we're
not
going live.
live yet.
Huh?
Hello? Oh, I hear me.
All right, we can start. Okay, so let's start with some beginning housekeeping with the AMA. So first thing is explaining the purpose, which is basically we're going to pull all the questions from Reddit. We have a list of questions that people have posted that we're going to go through and answer. But also for those of you who are in the live chat with us, definitely post any questions that you have in the live chat, and we'll probably flip flop between the questions from Reddit and some of the questions that come in from the live chat. So that's where we're going to be doing the questions from. But so everyone's familiar with us because there might be a lot of new viewers on here who may not be familiar with either Dennis or myself. We thought it'd be probably a good idea to just present a very basic and brief, an emphasis on brief background. So, Dennis, if you want to just go through some of your background, and I'll kind of explain mine.
Yeah, so my name is Dennis Lim. I graduated from the University of Florida with my bachelor's and my PharmD. Went on to do residency at Indiana University Health in Indianapolis, Indiana, as my PGY-1. Really focused on all of the clinical aspects of that residency with just a little bit of informatics involvement. And then as a PGY-2, I went to the Ohio State University. I was the first informatics resident at that program and kind of started that. It was nice because it let me really customize the experience to my interest, and my interest really is in automation. And so right now I am the chair for ASHP's section of operations and automation. I've been on that section for probably over 5 years now. In total, post PGY-2 graduation, I probably have like 6 years of experience. I think we're up to close to six now at this point. And so in addition to that, I also interview and I'm a preceptor for our residency. So just kind of having a broad experience and hoping to answer some questions that people have out there.
All right, thanks, Dennis. A brief background about myself, somewhat similar, but also a little different than Dennis. We both did go to the University of Florida. I did my undergrad and my pharmacy school there. I did my PGY-1 at Sarasota Memorial, which is a community hospital in Florida. And I did my PGY-2 in the University of Utah in Salt Lake City in Pharmacy Informatics. The type of position that I typically do and what I'm doing right now is in the infectious disease realm. So I do a lot with clinical decision support and building out the clinical tools for our ID practitioners. Total years of experience, I graduated the same year as Dennis, so about 6 years about this point. And I have been involved with ASHP section advisory group for professional development. I think I'm on my fourth year or something. Um, so a lot of that. Okay, so that's kind of my background, and we want to get to know the viewers as well because it looks like there's some people in here. Um, can you see the chat, by the way, Dennis? Should I pop out the chat? Can you see it?
Yeah, I see the chat.
Okay. So let me pop this piece out and we'll display it on the bottom or in the middle here. And for the audience who is listening in, we want to know about you guys as well. If throughout the stream, if you want to just leave maybe your name, let us know where you are in pharmacy school. Are you a student? Are you a resident? Are you a currently practicing pharmacist? Or maybe you're not in pharmacy at all and you're just tuning in because you're interested. Let us know, and we are going to get started. So, the very first question is from Relevant Hedgehog. I feel like that would be Andy if I were to guess, but I'm assuming that's not him asking. So he asks, can you give a brief summary of pharmacy informatics and your roles, responsibilities, or impressions? I've been super curious about it. And we can probably answer the second question next. So I can probably say a couple sentences, and I'll turn it over to Dennis because Dennis can probably give a more elaborate definition of this. In the last few years, I haven't been practicing in pharmacy informatics as much. But what I'll say about it is when I usually think about pharmacy informatics, the briefest I can explain it is any type of technology that interfaces in the medication use process. So from order entry to order verification, order administration, and order follow-up, there's many aspects of technology that touches that. So whether it's CPOE, CDS, BCMA, what have you, we interface with those roles. That's the easiest way I like to explain it. But maybe we'll let Dennis talk a little bit more and add on to that definition, and then we can then talk a little bit about our roles, responsibilities.
Yeah, so I think there's probably even maybe a more basic way to explain it because I think you used a lot of terminology there with like CDS and whatnot. Basically, informatics is the management and exchange of health information, and specifically, pharmacy informatics is the management and exchange of medication related, pharmacy related health information. And so that does encompass the full gamut of pharmacy practice. So if you think about pharmacy informatics behind how a medication can be ordered, so okay, what drug, what's the dosage form, where is it going, how it can be dispensed. So is it a tablet? Is it a capsule? And then you kind of get into more advanced topics such as decision support. So things like drug interactions and potentially automation. So robotics that you have in retail pharmacy, that you have in inpatient pharmacy. Behind any kind of technology, there is some sort of informatics basis. And behind any informatics basis, there's generally somebody working in informatics. So for a lot of folks at a lot of organizations, that'd be someone like us, pharmacy informaticists. A lot of times you also have informatics technicians as well. And so I think that is a growing role for those individuals too. But in general, it's the management of health-related information, for pharmacy.
Okay, so definitely a lot more elaborate than my definition. So let's talk a little bit about responsibilities. In a nutshell, I was well. Let's take a step back first. So our first job with our current institution was a go live where we converted our existing computer systems or legacy systems to the new Epic EHR. During that implementation, my primary role was to convert all of the antimicrobial stewardship and infection control tools into Epic. So that's the broad sense, and then everything underneath the sun that had to do with that, be it meetings, order sets, specific clinical decision support that's related to either of those programs, we converted into Epic. And that's probably the easiest way to explain it. And maybe I'll just let Dennis talk about his responsibilities.
Yeah, I think you're underselling yourself a little bit, Brian, in terms of your responsibilities. Certainly you did more than that, and I think we all did a lot more than I think what we even thought we were coming into doing. Because if you think about kind of healthcare and academic medical center, or even any kind of medical center, it's very hard to get around treating a patient without some sort of medication. And when you take a electronic health record live, every one of those workflows, every one of those point of contacts between a provider or clinician and the patient typically has some sort of medication involvement. And if there's medication involvement and if it's health information, there's pharmacy informatics involvement. And so my responsibility in that regard would be that I manage all the automation, I manage the exchange of information from our electronic health record to the automation, as well as how medications can be ordered, where it dispenses, when it dispenses, basically the med use process end to end, as it relates to medications within our organization. So, that's really ultimately just probably a minuscule scope compared to the whole field of informatics. informatics itself is a niche field, and then what I do is a niche field within informatics. There's certainly other opportunities. We mentioned clinical decision support. We mentioned the opportunities beyond just the academic medical center today. That there's patient-facing retail clinical informatics. There's all sorts of startup healthcare informatics out there. So I think informatics is a broader field than I think we anticipate.
Okay. So we do have a couple questions. We'll get to that in a second. We have one more question from Relevant Hedgehog from Reddit that we'll answer, and then we'll jump to the very first question from the chat. So the next question, maybe Dennis, you can start us off with, is did you have informatics experience prior to your PGY-2 in informatics? And if so, how did you get that prior experience? If not, how were you able to get your foot in the door?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We have a lot of candidates that will say it's really hard to get informatics experience, and in general, actually, it is. You really have to fight for those experiences. So when I was an intern, I had all 12 of my APPE, my API rotations at a particular site. And through that, I was able to convince them to give me some sort of informatics experience in terms of a longitudinal project. And I did something related to warfarin documentation. And pretty simple, not too complicated, no build necessary. That kind of got my foot wet. When I went to my PGY-1 residency, they did have an informatics rotation. And that was one of the reasons why I ranked them very high on my list. Actually, they were my first choice because of that. Ultimately, that gave me the opportunity to get a lot of preliminary experiences in informatics, shadowing experiences, a little bit of getting my hands dirty in actual build and configuration of electronic health records, but mostly just from the theoretical standpoint of this is how informatics works at a large multi-hospital academic medical center. So, if you don't have those opportunities available, I can promise you there is somebody at your organization, whether you're an intern, whether you're PGY-1, whether you're just a shadowing person that is dealing in informatics. You may have to find ways to pursue shadowing experiences in those areas. It's not something that many places are offering right now.
Yeah, I think that's my same impression. I didn't know you had experience during your APPEs either, so that was interesting to hear about. I think my approach or my perspective on this question about informatics experience, I think you can even go broader and define it. So, in people think about informatics sometimes as your hard technical skills with like coding and programming. I definitely think those kind of skill sets are helpful. And I can say that the role that I do, which is a lot of clinical decision support, I benefited from having experience in high school doing C++ programming and Oracle databases, especially since I do a bit of reporting as well. So that definitely helped. I did not, fortunate as Dennis, have any experiences during APPEs. I didn't even know what informatics was during my APPEs. So Dennis was ahead of the game at that time. But I did get a PGY-1 rotation in informatics. I actually had two because I ended up liking it so much. So that helped prior to PGY-2 to kind of say, hey, this is actually what I like. But I would also say one more thing is that you don't necessarily need quote unquote informatics experience. There are many other experiences in pharmacy school that helped me, like opportunities to do projects with your pharmacy organization. So I was webmaster for 3 pharmacy organizations. One of the projects I did was an online store. And your ability to, take a request from an organization, turn them into requirements, be it Google Docs, a sign-up sheet, or what have you, and then deliver on that is a key skill set in informatics. And I've used those kind of experiences to talk about during my PGY-2 interviews. So I thought that was very helpful. Okay, so that was the question there. Let's turn to the chat. C-Love says, hey. We say hey back. Tony's on the chat. What's going on, Tony? Good to have you here. Question from Sawyer. As both of you completed your PGY-1 residency programs a few years ago, How have you seen pharmacy residency evolve? I'm a P4 student interviewing. It seems to be getting more and more competitive every year. Mr. Dennis, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of insane. So like if you look back at the video, I think we did like what 2 years ago or something like that. I think I said like the max amount of places you should apply to is like 11. And I'm just looking through my Dropbox right now. I think I applied to like 7. I got 6 interviews. I think like 11 is like the minimum you should apply to now for a PGY-1 because it's just so crazy competitive. I hear people applying to like 20 plus, which is insane. There are definitely more interest in residencies than there are positions available. And I think that's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality. And I think part of it now becomes kind of a numbers game, and that you got to apply to that many to even have a chance at some of these places because there are also very good candidates out there. And so it's just a crazy number game. I don't know if you see it that way as well, Brian.
I do, and I probably should point out that Dennis and I probably have very different perspectives on some of these questions. So it'll be interesting to see where we diverge in some of our perspectives. But I do agree with you. I mean, I think anyone would say that it definitely is getting more competitive. A magic number that I heard from Tony Guerra, he did some analysis. I don't remember exactly what he did, but he did some analysis, and it seems as though 11 was the magic number, and I can't remember why, but he has a video that talks a little bit more about that. But no, I mean it's getting more competitive. It seems as though candidates need to do more and more each year to stand out. Okay, since the live chat is so hot, let's take another question from the live chat. Question from Danny. Does Pharmacy Informatics need a resident? I'm assuming that's a residency. Can you just
Probably
get a
resident.
PharmD and a master's in health info in informatics? So maybe I'll take a stab at this first and then we'll turn it to Dennis. And I wonder if this is where we're going to diverge a little bit. So my opinion, and I have a video about it back, I don't know, like 3, 4 years ago. The title of the video is "You Don't Need a Pharmacy Residency to Get into Pharmacy Informatics." And the basis of that assumption was that there were, I don't know, like 16 PGY-2s in Pharmacy Informatics. There's probably hundreds of positions out there. So the demand greatly exceeded the supply at the time. So no, you did not need a residency. Do I still think that is true? I actually do. It's the demand is not as high, I would say, and some of the videos I've interviewed other informatics pharmacists seem to reflect that. If anything, the demand has declined quite a bit. So it's not as easy, but is it possible? Absolutely. And then the only other thing I'll say with the masters is that I think Dennis, you were in that same session with me too. It was one of the mid years where we were all discussing um, getting a master's, weighing a master's in informatics versus a PGY-2 in informatics. And I think the consensus of that table, this was the mid year from like 2 or 3 years ago, was that your experience, i.e., PGY-2 in informatics, trumps the didactic experience from a master's. So if you were to weigh one over the other, residency would trump masters. But if you want to say which one's better, obviously having both would be better. So that's just my thought on that. Take it over there, Dennis.
I don't know that I disagree with that. I don't think we're very divergent in that thought. I mentored a couple of people over this past mid-year, and they really keyed in on this question of whether you need a farm like informatics residency, and I told them no. But at the same time, I think a lot of if you're set on working in a specific location, geographic location, or even a specific organization, then that kind of changes the equation. Yes, without a informatics residency, you can get an informatics position. You may not get it in the exact region or organization that you want. Part of it is that most of the academic centers, the major ones, are looking for informatics residency training, or at least numerous years of informatics, experience. So a lot of times, if you're not going the informatics residency route, you're going for the Master of Health Informatics route, then you're probably going to get that position if you wanted it at maybe a regional medical center, or maybe a smaller hospital in the area, or a smaller medical system, Or, if you're lucky and really jobs are all about timing, you may actually get it at academic center. It just depends on what the need is and when the availability of you are relative to that need. So, I think if you want to increase your chances of getting exactly what you want, where you want, then you will go for the residency route. And certainly a residency will never hurt you. But obviously, with residency, no one ever talked really about the financial aspects of that. For you to get into a residency, you're also giving up somewhere between like 80 to $50,000 in annual pay. So just think about the value of that residency relative to maybe starting a position as an informatics pharmacist, maybe at a smaller organization or maybe at a regional medical center.
I mean, most of our friends that didn't do residencies paid off their loans pretty fast.
Yep, then I will never pay off my loan.
Financial considerations, which I don't think we got any questions on Reddit about, is definitely a huge consideration. But that's not a question, so we're going to move on to the next question from our Reddit folks. Next one is from Saro. And the question is, any advice on how to study, review all the material we've learned for NAPLEX and to ensure a successful transition from student to resident? Is RX prep the way to go, or do you find other methods more useful? Okay, maybe better if we do rotations. Did I answer the last one first, or did you?
It doesn't matter. I actually looked this one up to see what I did because I forgot. I did RX Prep, the book. I think it cost like $159, and I did the test bank that came with RX Prep. That's all I did. And I had plenty of room left in terms of like score I needed to get to pass. So honestly, if you feel like you did pretty decent through pharmacy school, the NAPLEX is not going to be that hard of an exam unless it significantly changed in the past couple of years. Um, the thing that I almost failed twice now at this point is law. Which I'll be honest, I got like 70 and like 72, and that's like one question away from failing. And I will not look down on someone that has failed. Law, we didn't go to pharmacy to become lawyers, and if you fail law, you fail law, whatever. It's like a mark of pride, really. But NAPLEX, do RX prep, go do the book. I'm a visual person. I made flashcards, and I studied the flashcards, and that's it. Just did test bank a couple of times.
Did you not use the famous student doctor forums 120 math questions? You had to have used it.
Maybe I did, yeah. I mean, math is an important part of that, but
The what people would say to us back then, and I'm assuming is still true now. The NAPLEX changed, by the way, in 2016 drastically, but one of the major things pre 2016, and again, I'm assuming still, is that if you failed a portion of your math, you can't do math as a pharmacist, you're going to fail the exam. So the gold standard back then to passing the NAPLEX was 100%. You need to do the student doctor forum questions. There's 120 math questions on there that covers every variation of questions you'll see on the exam. And arguably, it would be harder. Both of those rang true when I took the NAPLEX, and I felt very comfortable with the math. It still exists. Just Google student doctor forums, look up 120 questions, and you'll see that. I think the other thing I'll say is I would say I do a lot of test taking. Like I study the test more so than the content sometimes. Studying the test itself is very important to being successful for the exam. And then taking practice exams. I remember NAPLEX, and they still have it. NABP has practice exams for NAPLEX. Highly recommend it. Definitely do practice exams to prepare. Otherwise, like Dennis says, 100% agree. If you're looking for residency or if you did well in pharmacy school in general, you wouldn't have much of an issue on the NAPLEX. So, RX Prep, that's right. I used RX Prep as well. RX Prep and student doctor forums were my main two things. So let's switch to the chat. Do you have tips on the PCAT? Oh, another test question from C-Love. Yeah, I wouldn't say I diverge too much from the answer I just provided. Practice tests is huge. Specifically for the PCAT, I would say practicing on the time of the exam. So was it like 4 or 6 hours? I don't even remember anymore. But if I took the
So
exam at 7,
long ago.
yeah, it was way long ago. I would wake up at 7, under time constraints, take a practice exam, and I kept on doing that to prepare myself for the PCAT. Otherwise, it was just reading the whole book, and I use Kaplan for the PCAT. I don't know, Dennis, do you have anything else to add for the PCAT?
I think I took Kaplan as well. I do vaguely recall having that book, and I think I took actual live courses too.
Live
Maybe
course.
we had a Kaplan
Oh, we did. It was that wasn't an actual class though, right? It was like a shortened. It was like a practice exam because it was free. I think I remember it was a free practice exam you can take to see how you might score on the actual PCAT.
it was in person.
Yeah, but it was just a test. I don't remember a
Maybe we
review
paid for like
course.
a practice test at the Kaplan test, and I don't remember. Yeah, it's something like that.
It's a long time
Yeah,
ago.
whatever. We gotta get through these questions, Brian. It's taking too long, man. You're too long-winded.
Let's move this chat. Hey, look at that. Space Cow. I'm assuming that's
Kyle Thomas.
Cow. Just saying hi, boys. Keep up the good work. Okay. Maybe we'll take another one from the chat.
What's
Anusha
your big tip
says,
that you have for interviewing
huh?
where they have us do a clinical case? Anna, it's the most recent one.
You have for interview where they have us do. Oh, go ahead. Why don't you take it, Dennis?
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned this in my other video. I think the most important thing is for you to know your general ambulatory care guidelines. So you're looking at hyperlipidemia, you're looking at diabetes, hypertension, potentially AFib and things like that. In general, your clinical cases aren't going to be like this crazy complex case where a person has sepsis and multi-drug resistant, sepsis that you need to figure out the right coverage for, using the right antibiotics, and it's not going to happen. So know your guidelines, know how to cite your guidelines, and if you don't know, please don't try to make up an answer. The worst thing you can do is be completely wrong. I think the better approach to clinical questions like that is say where you would look things up. Okay, say, you know what, I think the INR range is in this guideline. Before I would make a recommendation, I would look it up in there. Or if you don't know the guideline, hey, I would look it up in Lexicon or Up to Date, maybe Wikipedia. I don't know. It depends on the time. But tell people your thought process and explain how you would approach it and how you would try to resolve it if you truly don't know. But most of your clinical cases will be based on guidelines that you should know at this point in your career as a graduating, pharmacist. And most of those will be ambulatory care.
So I'll only add to that. Well, I'll emphasize a couple points. One point is thought process. Cannot emphasize that enough. As you go through the clinical cases, definitely walk through what you're thinking and why you would suggest certain things. Thought process, absolutely critical. The second thing is I might add to study sepsis because you're going into acute. I had a sepsis question. I had a sepsis case during one of my interviews, and mind you, this was actually my PGY-2 informatics interview. So they were asking me a clinical case on sepsis when I was interviewing for informatics. I mean, I do ID, so this was like a walk in the park. But the case was a very typical case. I was interviewed by two ICU pharmacists on how to handle a very typical case presentation for sepsis. And things they would ask is like, how do you know they have sepsis? How do you know they have SIRS? What is the typical treatment? What are the antibiotics? Very basic starting things.
Well, that's interesting though, because you said that was a PGY-2 interview, so that's assuming you've done at least like 6 to 7 months of your PGY-1,
Sure.
which you should have had like an ICU rotation and cover sepsis, I guess. So that might be fair, but if you're doing a PGY-1 interview,
Come
there's
on.
no
I
way.
I would expect your PGY-1 to know basic sepsis treatment, just like I would expect everyone to know DVT
Yeah,
prophylaxis for
no,
inpatient care. What?
no.
Here, let me add another one.
Clearly a different in this perception. But I'll tell
Okay.
you, I had no sepsis in my PGY-1 interviews. Okay.
Okay. Well, we can both agree that thought process is important.
Don't be
And
wrong. Just
yeah,
if you don't know, just tell me you don't know. You will get really marked off if you're wrong and you're confidently wrong. Um, know what you know what you don't know.
yeah. First, do no harm.
Yes.
Let's look at Reddit for the next question. From Thirsty Pineapple. Thirsty Pineapple says, to the graduates this year, if residency searching doesn't work out, can you speak a bit more about today's job market and what kind of jobs we'll be able to climb up to without residency training? Basically, feeling very worried and need some comfort and advice on realistic post graduation career paths. Maybe I can jump this one off. I can say, well, this would be interesting. I wonder if Dennis has different thoughts on this one. The first thing I'll say is we can start with the common denominator. And the common denominator is not a perspective, it is a statistical thing that was done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's actually been shared quite a bit on social media if you've been following. So I do have it pulled up because I don't remember the numbers. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a study, and they do it for all professions. In 2018, the number of jobs for pharmacists was 314,300. For the next 10 years, so this is what they project from 2018 to 2028, there's going to be little to no change. This is very different than what you usually hear about. It's increasing. No, they're projecting little to no change. And then the employment change in terms of raw numbers, they're projecting a loss of jobs by 100. So that's the basis. And then now Dennis and I can kind of share what we think might happen. So, very quickly, I think that there's going to be a decrease in jobs in your traditional sectors, like your especially community and retail settings. I think there's going to be a decrease in those jobs, probably way more than 100, based on the latest series of news of different pharmacies closing. However, I think that this study from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the way the pharmacy industry is heading, that there's going to be a lot more jobs in other areas of pharmacy that we don't typically think about. And they're all over the place. So, Dennis, what do you think?
You know, I wouldn't say that. I don't know that retail is shrinking as fast as maybe we perceive it to be. I think there's still not necessarily wage growth, but still job growth with lower wages relatively in the retail sector. In terms of your medical centers and inpatient care, without a residency, you're still able to get those positions. Now, timing is everything. Oftentimes, the most frequent positions that show up that a lot of those folks are able to get are going to be your overnight positions. Overnight has a lot of availability, and I think if you're really interested in getting into inpatient care and you don't have the residency training, you're not interested in going to residency training because that's a huge quality of life change. You're losing like $80,000. You know, that might be an opportunity to get your foot in the door. Go do overnights. Some of those are really nice because they're 7 on, 7 off, and that's a pretty good quality of life already. But do overnights, and then within the organization, you can start swapping schedules as kind of those availabilities open up. So I don't think that is out of the realm of possibility for someone that doesn't have residency training, especially if you're looking at smaller, maybe non-academic medical centers, especially if you're going to places where people may not necessarily be applying to in bulk. Obviously, if you're big coastal cities, big urban cities with big academic medical centers that have huge reputations, that's going to be different. So it's really about setting your expectations and being realistic about what you are able to obtain without a residency. Because I'll tell you though, a lot of times your PGY2s, and not to pick on our critical care colleagues, that is a saturated job market. And so these big academic centers can fill those positions with PGY-2 critical care trained residents residents in the daytime shifts all day. And eventually, as they stay with the organization, move them to their specialty roles. So that's what you're competing against realistically. And so if you don't have that training, you have to focus on where are the opportunities. And I will say, look at overnights, look at weekend shifts, look at kind of PRN shifts, even. And those are the things your residency training specialists generally don't go for.
I'll only add that I completely missed the point that the question had without residency training. 100% agree with Dennis
Leading
on that.
comprehension, Brian.
No, I 100% agree with Dennis, but the thing is that I think a key piece that I could add is that networking is critical. There could be many positions out there. There's definitely a lot of overnight positions and many, maybe even daytime positions for hospital jobs. But really, networking is critical because a lot of people are applying and it goes into a black hole. So networking can really boost your chances of getting a job without residency training or with residency training. As Dennis said about PGY-2 and critical care, I met a PGY-2 critical care resident, graduate 2 years ago that couldn't get a job and went into informatics actually. But okay, let's look at the chat. We skipped the top ones, man.
Oh yeah, we probably skipped two, but there's.
Oh, we might not even be able to answer that one. So Nusha says, I'm in the process of stating my Indian pharmacist license to US. Will I be able to volunteer to get that experience? To give a brief background, I'm a pharmacist currently working as data scientist. I want to explore into that field of informatics. Any thoughts, Mr. Dennis?
Yeah, that's not really an area I'm familiar with. In terms of the license transfer between the Indian pharmacy to US license, I assume, and this is where I barely passed laws, I don't remember. I do think that they need some sort of hours for, like, don't they need like happy hours? I could be wrong.
I'm
Either
not even
way,
gonna. I have no idea.
I have no idea. So yeah, that's a tough question. I don't know. If you have opportunities to go to organizations for shadowing, you can always ask for informatics opportunities. I think everyone has them. It's whether you know how to get into those kind of areas, and certainly that will help you get that necessary experience to kind of flex your career into informatics. But I'll admit that's not an area I know well in terms of license transfers.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. So sorry, can't help with that question. Let's. Wow, there's quite a few more. Let's take another one from Reddit since we just took one from there. So Drowned Duck says, going into P4, what advice or suggestions can you give to become a better PGY candidate? Mr. Dennis, you can take it away.
Have your clinical rotations up front, especially tough ones, because
Oh,
then you have more to speak to.
can I ask you there? So this is a question that I provide tips to students on, but I'm curious what you think here. So have your clinical rotations, right, during APPEs.
Yeah.
Is there a typical number you would recommend?
Well, you could absolutely kill yourself and do like ICU, internal medicine, like I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend a strong either internal medicine or critical care, strong ambulatory care before mid-year if possible, or at least before what you would anticipate would be your PGY-1 interviews, which is generally around the February timeframe. Um, because what that does is give you the ability to speak to more situations that you may not necessarily have that kind of experience if you don't have the rotation. So like, hey, tell me about a time where you made a significant intervention on a patient where you caught a potential error. If you don't have your clinical rotations, that may never happen, and then you're just kind of like, I don't know, can't tell you. Um, so don't like completely kill yourself with crazy rotations before, because you do want to give yourself time to actually learn, rather than just being like destroyed by the rotation. But make sure you have at least some of those experiences to kind of talk about. And the question goes into how to make yourself a better PGY-1 candidate. The thing that I mentioned in the previous video was that I think what we don't do well or not taught well to do is to highlight our experiences and our impact. And so things in during your rotation that you feel significant, I would encourage, and this was encouraged upon me, is to write in a journal or diary, maybe a blurb about, hey, today I made this intervention and this was the result. The doctor accepted it. We changed the antibiotic. It was totally too broad. And that may not mean anything, but in the end of the day, when you prepare for your interviews, now you have a list of things that you can speak to. Tell me about a time when you made a significant intervention. Well, there was this time, they were totally on the wrong antibiotic. They had antifungal coverage. They didn't need it. Made a recommendation. We changed it. That's not a bad story. Obviously it'll be explained better than that, but those are the things that you don't necessarily think of in the moment when you're interviewing. So it's helpful to have a journal of what you've done, in terms of your accomplishments over your rotations. I would say the same applies to PGY-1 residents. We do so much as PGY-1 residents that you sometimes forget all the things that you've done. And when you're looking for your PGY-2, how do you find your stories? Because interviews are all about stories, about what you can tell to convey a sense of yourself to the people. And in that case, having those items to show what you've accomplished, you can start developing what your narrative, what your story is in your interviews.
To add to that, the question specifically harps on going into P4 year. So I think the key I would say for advice is that this is very cliche to say, treat your rotations as interviews. First in, last out, look for opportunities to present, to work on projects. Some of the things I did is try to meet the RPDs. Sometimes you might not meet them, but ask if you can meet the RPD. Say you're interested in residency, you want to chat with them, meet the current residents, meet other pharmacists. So you might be on a rotation for, let's say, internal medicine, but you're interested in transplant because you're never going to have a transplant rotation or a critical care rotation. Ask to spend a day with them and talk with them. It expands your network. I think one of the key differences that Dennis and I did in approaching rotations that drastically differed is Dennis did a block for the whole year, and I chose to do rotations at different hospitals every month. There's lots of pros and cons to both approaches. I mean, I would waste like a whole week learning a new system and new workflows, and that would just kill 3 weeks of my rotation. I mean, one week of my rotation. But what I've gained from that is I expanded my network. Obviously, there's, again, pros and cons. But biggest advice, rotations is extremely critical to success, be it a future job or a PGY-1 residency, because those are the connections that will get you to that next step. So shine on your rotations. Let's see. Live chat.
Wow, we gotta speed this up, man. There are a lot of questions.
I know. Okay, let's try to do brief. Anna O says, "Hello. What's the biggest tips you have for interviewing where they have us do a?" Oh no, she already did that
I
one.
already did that. Ling.
How much of a disadvantage am I for applying for residency if I don't have my clinical rotations until after mid-year?
I think same concept applies. Yeah. If you don't have your clinical rotations until after mid-year, you're really going to have to stretch in terms of how you interview. Just think about things that you've done maybe in your internship year then, or if without those clinical rotations, you're going to get questions, whether it's fair or not, about, tell me about a time when. You're really going to have to figure out, and hopefully you can reflect back on your experiences and your appies to speak to some of those. That's probably my advice.
I think even to Dennis' points, to emphasize what Dennis said earlier, please don't say incorrect things and don't say things you don't know. I think that's very much appreciated. So if you don't have experience in a certain area, say you don't know, but do say where you would find the answer. Ling also says, I'm interested in medication safety and I was planning on asking my preceptor from that rotation for a letter of rec, targeting my LOI in that direction. It doesn't seem like that was a question. Good for
Well,
you,
let me
right?
just talk really quick about letter of X because I read a few in my life. When you ask for a letter of recommendation, please ask if they can give you a strong letter of recommendation. I actually see a lot of threads on Reddit where you're wondering why you never got the interview, you're wondering why you never got the on-site. Oftentimes, and it's unfortunate, but you see people apply and the letter of rec writers either don't know or don't fully support like the recommendation. Um, and when that happens, that's really the only narrative we have as interviewers to know anything about you. And that is often the time why people don't get invites, because your letter of rec was not strong. So if you want to get into med safety, that's great, and it will be a strong letter for you if you go that route, but make sure that they can give you a strong letter before anything else. It would be better to get someone non-med safety that can give you a strong letter than to get someone med safety that gives you a mediocre or weak letter.
Okay, I don't think I have anything to add to that. But we do have another question from Reddit from the same person, Thirsty Pineapple. Thirsty Pineapple says, another question I had was on the climate across the states, and I know you have had experience in many different states. Can you speak more about your experience in a different state, in the different states, such as progressiveness as pharmacists and pay in those areas as a pharmacist? I can be super brief. I can say that certainly there's. So I practiced in Florida, Salt Lake City, Minnesota, and now I'm in DC. I have not worked in DC even though I live here. I didn't really practice in Minnesota because it was more of informatics. Dennis might know more about the Minnesota practice. But between Florida and Utah, I can say that Florida was actually quite progressive compared to Utah. Back when I was working there, our techs and our P2 and P3s were doing med rec, as opposed to Utah, where actually we had a lot of the pharmacists doing it because we weren't quite ready to have our interns or our techs do it. That actually changed though after 2015, where we started providing more responsibility to both our technicians, to our students, interns at the time. So there's definitely a difference in the progressiveness. And maybe one more comment about progressiveness in general. The rule of thumb that someone told me is that the stronger the physician presence is in a specific hospital, you can think about your brand name ones, potentially the weaker it is in your pharmacy presence. And the added thing is the question that would come then is which programs are strong in pharmacy. I've learned which ones are strong in pharmacy kind of by word of mouth and by reading student doctor forums. You kind of know who the strong programs are. Dennis?
Yeah, I think your last comment about that is pretty accurate. I mean, you generally know what your stronger programs are and where pharmacists have a larger scope of practice. Um, if you want to talk in broad generalizations, it's probably true that stronger the physician group, probably not as strong the pharmacy group. I will tell you there are many places where that's not true, but when you speak kind of in broad generalities, I guess I can see that. Your border pharmacy is probably the most is the strongest dictator of your scope of practice as a pharmacist. And so, for example, when I was at Ohio State did pass provider status for pharmacists, very big scope. And in terms of our pharmacy practice there, very wide, very broad. Other organizations, that don't have pharmacy provider status through the Board of Pharmacy. There we did a lot even in Florida, and there's no provider status there that I'm aware of. So, it also depends on the organization's culture and how the pharmacy department and provider practice work in collaboration or lack thereof. So it really depends on the organization more so than any specific state or board of pharmacy regulation.
Okay. Next question from O. Gomez. Hello all, hope everyone's doing well. I'm interested in breaking into informatics specialty. I don't see myself going to residency, giving real life stuff. I do have a technology background, BS computer engineering. I would like to stand up from other strong potential candidates. What do you suggest? Certs, CP HIMS, currently working in inpatient settings. Stand up from other candidates.
Yeah, I can start on this one. I mean, CPMs and any kind of certification won't hurt you. It definitely does help. I think the best way to stand out, and is this about informatics residency or just informatics jobs?
Informatics specialty.
So maybe a job position. I think a job position is a little different than residency. Having the necessary experience, um, the experiences that would help you the most would be the ones that will be applicable to the position you're applying. I'm trying to word this in the right way, but essentially, for example, if you're going into informatics at a medical center that's focused on inpatient care, actually the experiences that help you the most is previous experience with inpatient care. Understanding the workflows, understanding why certain things happen, and the reasoning behind certain things happening in the pharmacy. Understanding pharmacy operations, understanding clinician workflows, understanding how to talk to providers and why they need to do certain things. Because the informatics aspects of most organizations, that can be taught to you, but the clinical workflows are something that you need to learn and know by experience. And so I think that might be probably the most helpful for a pure informatics position if you're seeking it, without a residency. Residency is a little different because we would look for something more along the lines of like previous projects, not that would hurt you, previous experiences, rotations, and whatnot.
Yeah, I think those two key things I would echo pretty strongly as well. Work experience. I probably hired 3 contractors over the last 4 years for my institution. And, many times in informatics positions, for jobs especially, you have a deadline to meet. So you're looking for someone who has previously worked in a certain area or has certain experiences. So prior experience is critical. I'll only add the caveat that if I see potential in someone who perhaps has some great clinical experience or experiences beyond just informatics, being able to communicate with clinicians is really a good thing to have. So if I see someone with potential, I'll interview them. But key work experience is really, really important. But let's move on from that. Try to be brief, right? Next question from Professor Panini. What kind of name? Could you comment both of y'all's experience in the interview matching process? How does phase 2, the scramble, differ from phase 1, and what changes do you suggest making between each phase to better appeal to programs?
Yeah, there's also another question like two below that about scramble. So maybe you can talk about scramble.
All right, so for those of you who missed the intro, we'll just reiterate here. So Dennis and I both did PGY-1s and PGY-2s. I actually did not match for my PGY-1 and I scrambled. Now, what differs between then and now is that they actually have something called a phase 2 that did not exist when I was scrambling. But what happened when I applied was we had a match and then we basically had the scramble. Now is phase 1, match, phase 2, match, and then the scramble. So in terms of the scramble, maybe we'll try to meet those two things. What's the question that you saw in there? You saw a question about scramble.
Like two below that on Reddit.
Oh, on Reddit. So what did you do to match with the program? Okay, so I'll try to be brief again. I applied to about 12 programs when I found out I was going to be in the scramble. I heard back from two, and then maybe I'll use those two as examples of what to do if you find yourself in the scramble. The first one I heard from was a program I previously applied to, but I didn't get an interview for. So, what does that tell me? It tells me that there are internal lists. You know, you apply, there's hundreds of people that apply to these programs. What makes you think a program's going to pick you? There's got to be something else that makes it stronger. Sometimes, that's just my opinion, right? Is that there's some connection. My connection to this program was that I applied previously, and when they reached out, they said, "Hey, I saw that you applied to us, but we just didn't give you an interview." So that tells me there's internal lists. The second example I got an interview from was a place I previously did 2 rotations at. And so they contacted me and they wanted to give me a phone interview, but then they were like, "Oh, we actually know you a little bit." And they pushed me past the phone interview, invited me strictly for the on-site. So going back to what Dennis and I said earlier about rotations, rotations can make a huge difference in many of these times. In this case, I just happened to be lucky and I got an interview for this site because I did a rotation with them and I did well. So maybe we'll just stop there. Is there any other comments you want to add about experiences in the interview matching process?
Mm, when you're ranking, please don't try to play games at the rank. Just rank on what you prefer in terms of your fits, in terms of how you like the organization. See a lot of threads out there about what's my strategy for ranking. Your if you put a strategy to it, you're gonna find yourself like unranked. um, don't strategize and try to like game the system. Just rank what you think fits best for you and what you want to accomplish in your residency, and whether you think that program will help you accomplish it.
Okay, moving on. Anusha says, yes, I need 1,500 hours, but I wanted to do informatics domain. That's a lot of hours. Tony says, every day is an audition. And Ling says, was curious about what your thoughts are. That is my plan to apply for PGY-1, PGY-2 med safety and policy. Also, do you recommend that 2 of your letters rec from APP preceptors versus 1 from professor? Dennis, you're probably closer to this. You want to take that question?
I don't know that it matters a lot. The one thing that I look at when I look at professor letters is, and this is in full disclosure, I had a professor write my PGY-1 letter of rec as well. How much time have they spent to you compared to a preceptor? Personally, some of those letters I feel aren't that strong because they don't spend a lot of time with you. They're looking at your CV and just like regurgitating, why you want to do a residency. Whereas a preceptor that you've actually spent a lot of time with can say a lot more about your experiences, especially when they fill out that form and like they rank all the things that, whether you're achieving or not. Same with your boss. It depends on how often you see your boss. If it's just like quarterly meetings and you sit down, is there going to be a lot of value in that interaction that they can write you a strong letter of rec? Really, it goes back to how strong your letter of rec is, not so much who it's from. Although I do pay attention to that sometimes. Obviously, if it's from a preceptor that has direct role in your education, it means more than a professor who might see you in office hours on a weekly basis. So, just some thoughts into that, but in the end, it's really how strong those letters are.
Oh, we have 2 more questions from Reddit. It might be pretty good here. So, next question is from Chronic Indecisive. Question is, where are you headed post graduation? So, we graduated quite a bit ago, so I don't know if that was maybe directed toward my school, but what opportunities are you currently exploring? You want to take that, Mr. Dennis? Or do you want me to start?
I mean, opportunities are always going to be out there. It's just whether you weigh the benefits versus potential costs of those. And so informatics, there's always opportunities. It's not as saturated as some of the other specialties. And if you come out of an informatics residency, I think you'll have plenty of opportunities in your choice. Um, Helping our resident get their position this year was easy. I'll leave it at that, that there's plenty out there.
And I'll probably answer this from the perspective of graduating from my master's in public health, just because I'm assuming that's what maybe they're referring to. Um, so, in terms of opportunities, if anyone is familiar with some of the stuff that I do, I have always wanted to go to the CDC, and that's something I've been thinking that's been on my mind for the last decade. So, in terms of opportunities exploring, I'm not currently exploring anything, but a long term goal of mine would be to be in a role that is in the intersection of informatics, healthcare, infectious disease, and public policy. So, I don't know what that looks like, but that's something that I would like to do. So, maybe second question from that is how has it been for your peers who did not go on to complete a PGY-2 residency, and what areas are they currently in? I'll briefly comment on that and I'll turn over to Dennis. Um, our class, maybe Dennis can remind me, it was I believe there's like less than 30% of our class that actually went into residency. So the vast majority of individuals did not do a residency. And from me stalking them on Facebook, they all seem to be doing pretty well. They have a house, they have kids, they have paid off their loans. I have none of that. So I would say they've been doing pretty well. And areas that they've been in, they're all over the place. So yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, financially speaking, they're way ahead of us. Jeez. Think about 2 years of residency. That's about $150,000 you're giving up. That pretty much pays for the pharmacy education. So, job satisfaction wise, and speaking to some of them, if you're stuck a um, in a community setting, especially if you're the big retail chains, it's kind of a tough life. You have metrics you got to hit, immunizations and vaccinations and, patient counseling. You know, the job satisfaction may not be at the level, but it's really what kind of balance you're looking for in life. At the same time, a lot of those folks actually are moving towards things like managed care and MTM. I think that's almost a natural transition for a lot of those folks, rather than coming into the inpatient side. I have seen some movement to the inpatient side as well, like a clinical generalist position, kind of moving on from that into more specialized generalist positions. So there are opportunities out there. It depends where you want to be and depends on kind of what you expect out of your quality of life, both inside and out of work.
Okay. And the last question was actually the one we answered earlier about the scramble process. So that is kind of the end of the questions. I don't think we're going to take any more from Reddit. So we're probably going to wrap this up here. But before we do, does Mr. Dennis have any remaining comments? On a Friday night oh, wait, it's early for you. It's like 6?
6. I
Oh,
need dinner, man.
it's like 9 p.m. over here. This is what I do at 9 p.m. on a Friday. But any remaining comments, Mr. Dennis? Maybe some words of wisdom or some advice to all those residency seekers out there.
Uh, get good letters of rec. Don't play games with the rank list. Um, know your stories and how to present yourself, uh, especially things that you've accomplished. You know, when you're answering interview questions, think of the STAR format, situation, task, and, what you did as your action and then what was the result. Um, Standardized responses like that are really helpful. Um, there's a lot of questions out there what you do post interview. If you send us a card, that's great. I personally love cards. I probably won't get it until like 3 months after the match. So if you're looking for a fast response, just email. Thank you. It's great. In terms of people asking about correcting things that they made as a mistake during your interview, um, it's helpful to an extent. If you know the person who you can email, oftentimes you don't have all of their contact information. If you're emailing RPD, almost certainly it won't matter. If you're emailing the person directly where you made that mistake, it might. But then again, it just depends on what the mistake was and whether it's even worth doing that. Because the other side of that is they may not have even noticed it, and then now you just brought it up in their minds. Um, yeah, I mean, pharmacy and especially pharmacy informatics is a small world. Don't burn your bridges. That's it.
I asked for like words of wisdom. You gave me like a speech, dude.
I have a lot of wisdom, so I mean,
All right, that's fair enough. Fair enough. We can wrap this up here. I think the only thing I'll say because of my experience of not matching is that there's gonna be about 30% of folks typically that don't match. If you don't match, it's not the end of the world. There's many opportunities outside of that. Make sure you leverage your network and have a good support group. So. All right, guys, we'll wrap this up. Thanks, Mr. Dennis. If you'd like to see more of Mr. Dennis, leave some comments and some love for him in the comments of the video. And maybe we'll have him back next time. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. See y'all.